I'm standing here in front of 906 Post Road, which is the birthplace of Scarsdale's first suburban development. This was the location of the George Arthur farmhouse, which was bought in 1890 by Frank Swartwout, one of the directors of the Arthur Suburban Home Company. And it would be the first farm in Scarsdale to be subdivided into lots to build rows of private homes. The farm consisted of 150 acres stretching from Post Road all the way to the New Rochelle border, which is the Hutchinson River, then down to the border of Eastchester. The Swartwout house, also known as the Barker farmhouse, was perhaps as old as 1684. It was the oldest known house in Scarsdale until it was torn down in 1962 to build 4 homes that are built on this side and on Gaylord Road on the backside. Now, Post Road had been an old Indian trail, and it was where the first farmhouses were built in Scarsdale. From the 18th through the 20th centuries, there were 6 farmhouses here on Post Road in between Drake Road and the Eastchester line. Of those 6, only one of them is still left, the Cudner Hyatt House here. The Cudner Hyatt House was the home for 2 centuries, mainly to 2 families, the Cudners and the Hyatts. And when Caleb and Elvira Hyatt passed away in the early 70s, the house was bought by the Scarsdale Historical Society and used as a museum until 2016. It was decorated as a 19th century farmhouse. Children from all over Westchester visited to experience what farm life was like in rural Scarsdale. Caleb remembered his father, Oliver Hyatt, describing George Arthur of the Arthur farm as a pretty hard citizen, a recluse, and entirely uncooperative. And the next owner, Colonel Hayes, was worse. Caleb said he had a shocking temper and used to shoot at little boys looking for guinea eggs on his farm. Caleb drew from memory a sketch of what his family's farm looked like in 1890 before it was sold to developers. The farm stretched from the Post Road all the way down to the Bronx River. Across the Post Road from the Hyatt farm and north of the Arthur farm were the Nelson and Drake farms, which would become the rest of the Edgewood neighborhood of Scarsdale. Small portions first started to be developed in 1908, but much of it remained farmland or small estates until the boom of the 1920s. The Weed House off Post Road on the Nelson farm was built in 1752, and it was close to where Edgewood School is today. It was first owned by farmer Elijah Cudner and bought by Orrin Weed in 1832. The main house on the Drake farm also dated back to before the American Revolution. The farm had been part of an enormous tract of land the Heathcote estate sold to John Delancey in the 1700s. Elias Drake eventually purchased the house and farm in 1854. In 1891, Oliver Hyatt sold part of his farm to the North End Land Development Company and bought part of the Drake farm and named it Ferncliff. On the very same day, Colonel Hayes sold the Arthur farm to the Arthur Suburban Home Company. Arthur Manor was originally planned as a grid like Manhattan. Lots were sold at $100 and up, and people usually bought 2 or 3 of them on which to build their own homes. By 1895, there were only 12 houses, and the community would grow slowly over the next 20 years. There was no electricity until 1904, and originally no paved roads, running water, or gas. At first, most of the roads were named after the directors of the Arthur Suburban Home Company. Now, Scarsdale's early developers often lived and participated in the communities they built as they brought in a new population of suburban homeowners. The construction of the railroad in the mid-1800s allowed people to live farther from where they worked in New York City. Travel became more affordable and convenient, and a trip to New York City could cost as little as 9 cents provided you bought the monthly fare. Now, the Arthur Manor brochure advertised that the Scarsdale train station was very near the development, but that wasn't really the case. And in fact, for the first 10 years of the development, the developers had a stage going to and from the Scarsdale station so people wouldn't have to walk. Now, the directors really stretched the truth when they displayed Chester A. Arthur, the 21st President of the United States, on the cover of their brochure. And for years, the myth persisted in newspapers and books, claiming that the president or his relatives had lived on Arthur Farm. but there was zero evidence to support that claim, and Oliver Hyatt was quoted as saying, "If that was true, it must have been his ghost." The developers knew that people wanted to escape the crowds, poverty, and pollution of the cities. They promised health, pure air, rapid transit, and free sand and building stone. The brochure also assured buyers that the neighborhood would be free from noxious factories and the nuisances of offensive businesses and trades. This would foreshadow Scarsdale's strict zoning laws that forbade factories and largely limited businesses to downtown Scarsdale or the Five Corners in Heathcote. Arthur Manor, and later all of Scarsdale, would become a residential community of private homes, and new jobs and services would have to be created to respond to the needs of this growing community. So we're in front of 24 Sprague Road, which was the original site of the Volunteer Fire Company No. 1 in Scarsdale. There were 2 lots that were donated by the Arthur Suburban Home Company, and they erected the firehouse here. Arthur Manor was very sparsely populated at the time, but everyone joined in the effort. The company was all volunteer, drawing everybody in the community from farmers to new residents, including Frank Swartwout, one of the original developers. The fire apparatus originally consisted of a horse-drawn wagon with hatchets because there was no public water supply yet in Scarsdale. The horses had to be borrowed from a local farmer, and if they weren't available, the firemen themselves pulled the wagon with a 50-foot rope. The fire company later upgraded to a chemical apparatus and moved into a new station on Popham and Post Roads in 1924. The Sprague Firehouse was also an important community center, and upstairs was a meeting hall and Sunday school, and the first homes of Scarsdale Congregational Church and the Immaculate Heart of Mary Church. IHM originally started above the firehouse in Arthur Manor. I then moved over here in 1913, 1914 it opened up. But originally the steps came down from the front door down to the sidewalk here, and this would have been a place where the congregants would have talked before or after the service. Before IHM was built, Catholics in Scarsdale would have to go down to Tuckahoe or up north on Post Road in order to find their church. After IHM was built, it certainly contributed to Edgewood becoming a more Catholic area, certainly than the rest of Scarsdale. Between 1890 and 1915, the town grew from 633 people to nearly 3,000. Improved train service, real estate development, and the promise of automobile travel on the coming Bronx River Parkway made Scarsdale a very desirable place to live. An increase in crime prompted the village to hire a small police force, and many of them lived here in Arthur Manor. The police force grew quickly, mostly enforcing traffic laws, minor violations, and burglaries, but there were a few murders, including one of a police officer. Sergeant John J. Harrison lived here on Lyons Road. On July 19, 1923, he was shot and killed while trying to apprehend 2 men who had stolen a car. The car was abandoned, and the men escaped and were never caught. Scarsdale organized a fund to provide for Harrison's widow and children and raised $13,000, about the equivalent of $200,000 today. This fund later became the Scarsdale Foundation, an organization that still helps people in Scarsdale today. Benjamin Ruggiero was Scarsdale's first police chief, and he lived on Hamilton Road. He was an Italian immigrant from Sorrento who had taken detective courses in New York City, but it was his ability to ride a motorcycle that got him hired by Scarsdale. They spent $300 to buy a motorcycle and spare parts that began the motorcycle team that patrolled Scarsdale until the 1940s. However, in 1918, Ruggiero suffered a terrible accident while pursuing a speeding car at the corner of Popham and Post Roads. His motorcycle was smashed into, quote, kindling wood, and he was lucky to survive. He decided to retire from the police force and opened up a cycle and automobile shop at the corner of Popham and Post Roads, where the gas station is now. Because that preceded the zoning laws in Scarsdale, it's the only customer-facing business on Post Road in Scarsdale. After Arthur Manor was gridded up into lots in 1891, it took decades for all of the lots to be sold. And in the second half of the 20s, development really accelerated, and Arthur Manor was getting crowded. And there were no parks. Fortunately, the block that's now Davis Park had no homes built on it yet. The village was able to swoop in and for $26,000 buy the 1.4 acres and dedicate it to what is really the gem of the community. This very quiet park with a playground in one corner and a quiet recreational space. As more people moved into Arthur Manor and Edgewood, the need for a larger school became a priority. Edgewood School was built in 1918 on the apple orchard of the Weed Farm. Previously, students from this neighborhood would have had to go all the way up to the school built at the corner of Tompkins and Post Road. They might have been driven by Mr. Weed in his horse-drawn wagon. In 1906, a new school was built at Popham and Post Roads, where Village Hall is now. In 1906, there were only 100 students in Scarsdale District 1, but by 1917, there were 415 of them, and there was need to expand. 250 students would be assigned to Edgewood School, 135 to Green Acres, and 140 more to the high school. All of these schools were designed by the same architect, Mr. Lowell. Heathcote, Fox Meadow, and Quaker Ridge elementary schools hadn't been built yet, nor had the middle school. The cupola was added in 1929. However, at that time, it was a clock tower. The clock hands on all four sides were wrenched off on April Fool's 1932 and never replaced. The Weed property, part of which was sold to build the school, and the Nelson Farm were developed much later than Scarsdale Park and the Ferncliff neighborhoods in Edgewood, and almost 2 decades after Arthur Manor. So connecting the developments together proved to be a challenge. So we're here at Madison Road, and one of the strange things is how these two roads, Rodney Road and Edgewood Road, converge in when there's really nothing here. It's not like it's a business center or any reason for that. So the reason why Edgewood and Rodney come in like this is because the farm to the north, Drake Farm, was developed first. And the developers just maxed out and went all the way up to the border of the neighboring farm, which was this diagonal with the Nelson Farm to the south. Then, years later, the central portion of Edgewood was developed, and they wound up having their own road system, building a road coming down here. Here on Nelson Road, you can see some of the problem solving that also happened to happen in the late 20s. Arthur Manor was fully gridded out, and it ended on Carmen. So they wanted to build streets through, but the problem was that already on Carmen, a lot of homes had already been built, so the streets couldn't cut through. And that's why on Carmen you see a lot of T intersections. But there's two that do cut through, Madison and Nelson. So Nelson you see here, and this is 41 Carmen, which was built in 1897. The village had to buy lots to get through, and by the time the late 20s came around, there weren't a lot of options left. So they bought part of the side yard and the remainder, and they went through there, and that's why you have only about a 4 to 5 foot setback from that house to the road. The eastern section of Arthur Manor along the Hutchinson River that borders New Rochelle has fewer homes. Swampland and flooding along the river inhibited builders in the early years of Arthur Manor's growth. We're here at the Hutchinson River, and it's so small because it really only starts about a half mile north of here, just across Drake Road. And one of the stories that I stumbled across that I like about it was apparently the Tobin family that lived just off of the Hutch over by Boulevard had a farm, would hollow out a tree and put gallons of fresh milk into it, and any traveler could come by, and for 2 or 3 cents you could have a cup of fresh milk, and there were instructions to wash the cup in another part of the stream and put it back, and apparently the system worked really well. So that gives you an idea at the turn of the 20th century of how quiet things were here. Drake Road forms the boundary between the Edgewood neighborhood and the Heathcote neighborhood to the north. Elias Drake proposed the road in 1859 as the boundary between his farm and Lang property where the Women's Club is now. By the early 1900s, prominent real estate developers Scarsdale Estates bought part of the Drake farm and named it Scarsdale Park, laying out Madison, Jefferson, Hamilton, Nelson, and Richelieu roads. However, the area wasn't substantially built out until the late 1920s. The Ford family bought the Drake's historic home and operated a small farm until 1921, when Adele and Alfred Haywood bought the house. I'd like to read you a few passages from a letter Mrs. Haywood wrote to the Scarsdale Historical Society, which gives a unique glimpse of life in this neighborhood before it was developed. When we bought the old Ferncliff Place in 1921, it was a typical Victorian house. It sat on its hilltop, surrounded by 2 or 3 acres of open field, with daisies, goldenrod, and fine old trees. The approach to the house was between 2 mammoth stone posts at the corner of Post Road and Drake. There was a winding, rocky drive to the front porch. When I was told that the price was only $17,000, I called my husband, he came over, and we made the deal on the spot. Scarsdale at this time was hardly a suburb, but more a very ancient village. We were told that our old stone wing was an outpost of an enormous farm and was used during the Revolutionary War as a prison. Before we entered the picture, there was no ugly gas station or firehouse across the street. Our view across Post Road was open fields, as Berkeley had not been developed. There was not a house on the Drake Road side or Sunset Drive. Ferncliff Road boasted of only one house between the public school and us. A trolley ran along Post Road to White Plains. There were no buses, so we walked to the station. Lovely old Wayside Cottage was in those days our women's club, where we had small dances, only 12 or 15 young couples having moved to town by then. Now I will reply to your question about the existence of a well. We never heard of one. The little stone house was the covering for a deep, old-fashioned ice house, dug very deep for refrigeration purposes. When you look carefully, remnants of the past are visible everywhere in Scarsdale, in old stone walls, trees, mill ponds, mileage posts and markers, and of course, old houses. In Arthur Manor, many of the original houses are still standing or have been modernized. The families have changed, but the deep sense of community that was created in the early days of Arthur Manor and Edgewood has never left the neighborhood, and Old Scarsdale is very much alive in New Scarsdale today.